911 operators, what is the scariest or strangest call you've ever gotten? Scariest was a woman who called and said her husband had a gun and was threatening to kill himself in front of her. While the officers were on the way, they wanted to talk to her. While I was transferring her, she said he's pointing the gun at me, but luckily the officer picked up right after and I could disconnect. I was still in training at the time, so it was scary. Worst call was an old man who called saying he accidentally ran over his son with his combine. His son tripped while he was next to the big wheel and went under it. He was crushed. I froze for a solid 10 seconds not knowing what to do because my mind went blank. This was when I was fresh out of training, so I was still inexperienced with that level of intensity. It's not scary in the sense of creepy, but it really affected my mom, and she had to take a break for a while after it. My mom works in the psychological support line for the 911, meaning that if somebody calls because they're just too sad, lonely, overwhelmed, or just want someone to talk to, the call gets transferred to my mom. She got a call at the end of her shift that night, and it was a guy around my age who simply stated he was sad and did not want to be alone that night. My mom asked the regular questions just to make sure that he was safe and continued talking to him. He told her about how his parents abused him since he was very little. He told her every detail of it. He explained to her that that was the reason he did not have any friends or close family members, how he lived alone now, and he cried a lot every night. My mom continued talking to him when he suddenly says he feels very sleepy and he might have to hang up soon. My mom knows this is usually a sign that he might have taken something, so she dispatches an ambulance to his house and tries to keep him on the line. The ambulance took 2 hours to get to his house because they said it was not an emergency, even though my mom told them it was and she was certain about it. She stayed on the line for 2 hours trying to get this person to stay awake and continue talking because the ambulance took so long, until he eventually stopped replying to her. When they got there, he was already dead. He was lying on the couch with a phone on his hand and my mom on the line. Not a 911 operator, but a paramedic. Strangest, scariest would have to be when we got a dispatch for a cardiac arrest. The dispatcher told us that a woman had found her sister in a bag and was screaming about not being able to find her legs, but was too hysterical to answer any clarifying questions. Turns out the woman had gone to her sister's house because they hadn't seen or heard from her in a week, which was odd. She found her sister dismembered in a trash bag in the backyard and some of her limbs were in a burn barrel nearby. Sister's husband had killed her and was trying to dispose of the body. 3 years ago, a 5-year-old girl found her parents dead in their bedroom with blood all over the place and a bullet on the floor. She was in the backyard and heard some shots, and after 2 hours of hiding she found the body. Not mine, but an old friend of my mom's we'll call Judy. Judy was a switchboard operator in high school before 911 was a thing. She got this call one day from a dude who was keeping a literal and actual, fully grown deer as a pet. Not only that, it was a male adult deer. This guy had raised said deer since it was a baby and it had been fine for years, but it was still a wild animal. Mating season had rolled around and for whatever reason it had decided that its owner was competition. In short, this man was being attacked by his pet buck. Judy called the cops, but she had to stay on the line until they got there, so she had to listen to him being gored to death on the other end of the phone by a deer. Needless to say, they didn't get there in time to save him, and Judy still has nightmares about the whole thing 50+ years later. Oh, there are just so many times I've walked people through CPR after someone calls 911 to say their spouse isn't breathing. Crew arrives and finds an elderly patient doing CPR on a blanket or a pillow. No ill intent, just mental health problems. Took a call where a guy was stabbed, just wanted to keep him talking, so asked if he knew who did it. He named the guy and then stopped responding seconds later, dead when the crew arrived. Fairly rare, but we sometimes get calls from people saying their pet isn't breathing or is choking and they want us to walk them through CPR or send help. I've taken 3 calls where people chopped off their penis. 2 of them were sitting in a tub. 1 had microwaved it. I would say 50% of all calls are related to drugs and alcohol. Maybe 25% are mental health related, and then 25% random accidents or medical emergencies. I've taken 3 calls where people chopped off their penis. Fuck. I could understand 1. There's crazies out there sure. But 3. I have a friend who works for a crisis line. A call came through from a guy standing on the wrong side of the barrier on a bridge. He was ready to jump. After some time my friend convinced him to climb over onto the right side. As he was climbing over he slipped and fell off the bridge. His family will never know that he had actually changed his mind and it wasn't suicide. My friend was gutted. Filled in as a 911 operator and dispatcher for a rural county a few decades ago. Got a call for an MVA one night. The car had gone off a 60-foot embankment ending up upside down in a shallow river. As calls played out, there had been 6 occupants all deceased. Bodies found from the accident site to half-mile downriver. 3 of the occupants had been friends or acquaintances of mine. The stress of knowing that and taking calls from family members I knew most of the night soured my young self on the job. Please give rural first responders extra support. PTSD by proxy is a real thing. Not scary or strange. Just sad. I received a call from a man whose father was having a heart attack. It was a rural area, and although most people knew each other, it was policy not to use anyone's name on the radio. I toned and dispatched the ambulance service and gave a play-by-play of directions on country roads from the caller to the ambulance service. It took them almost 20 minutes to get out to the area of the farm where the patient was. Toward the end, they had trouble finding them, and I had to ask the caller several times to repeat the directions. The patient didn't make it, largely due to the time it took the responders to arrive. About 2 hours later, the sheriff, ambulance and fire chief, and the caller arrive at the jail where we dispatched. The caller was yelling at me saying "You killed my father," over and over again. It wasn't until he listened to the tape of the call and learned that in his panic he gave me the wrong directions did he stop. I was told that if I had been allowed to use the victim's name on the radio, the driver would have known exactly where to go. The fire chief and sheriff tried to console me, but I was a wreck for weeks. That was the most traumatic for me, and I've not talked about it for years. Private security / emergency control room operator here. I have a lot of different stories I can share, so here's just one. We received a call from a lady, but when you work at a job for a decent amount of time like that you start to recognize your clients' voices. We immediately knew it was the local town crazy. Let's call her P. Now, P was certified batshit insane. If you work night shift and work the inbound calls you would dread getting a call from her because she claims she sees ghosts, that her neighbors try to kill her every night, and that her family is in on the thing because they keep trying to take her to an asylum, but P refuses to do so because she claims she is mentally well. The family tried getting the police take her in, but because there is no certifiable evidence that she is insane they couldn't do anything about it. I've worked there for 3 years, and she phoned about every night even from before I started there. Right. So this one fateful night, guess who was working inbound that night? Right off the bat, when I answered she said she saw a spirit come out of her, and she knows definitely it's her neighbors that are trying to steal her soul. She also mentions how scared her cat looks, and how desperately it's trying to claw its way out for her to open the window. She says this is odd behavior of her cat, but she mentions it every time she calls how the cat is trying to get out. Seems she forgets every conversation from previous nights. Now I just calmly tell her we can send a response officer to patrol the area as that usually appeases her, then we hang up and that's that for the night. Usually, 2 hours later we receive a panic from wouldn't ya know, the neighbors of P. She was trying to break in and stab them with a knife. She kept claiming that they tried to steal her soul and she won't allow them to harm anyone else. Needless to say, police got called in. They saw how crazy she was. She got sent to an asylum 2 provinces over, and we haven't heard of her since. Kinda scary that I was the last person she talked to before she decided to try and kill her neighbors. Chilling. And that's just one story. Not an operator, but I'm a big city cop. I've had 4 kids die in my arms / presence. 2016. Had a 5-year-old kid literally die in my arms after he got hit by an old Ford F350 truck. Kid was getting ice cream from ice cream truck and goes to cross the street and go back home. Dad is pissed drunk and sees truck coming. Goes to grab kid, but trips him into the street instead. Truck hits him and drags him 25 feet. I was driving down a main street just north. Got to the scene about 20 seconds after dispatch puts out the call. I pull up and see the kid laying in the street. Mom and dad are screaming in Spanish for me to save him, but kid's skull is crushed. Started CPR while fire arrived. I pick the kid up to load him on gurney to save time, and he took his last breath in my arms. Fire took him anyway, but he was gone. I hate wearing lotion because it feels the same as the kid's blood did on my arms that day. The other kids were pool drownings and vehicle ejections. Coast Guard Command Center. So the maritime version of 911. You call Mayday on the radio. I pick up. Probably when I got the call that we lost one of our own helicopters. I never saw the report, but from what I gathered they were trying to take off in the winds. This was hurricane response, caused them to crash at Tikiyaf. Everyone got out and no lasting injuries. But the helo caught fire and I'm pretty sure had to be scrapped. For sure one of the more memorable ones, since it's different when it's one of your own, and also aircraft emergencies tend to kill people a lot better than sinking boats. Scariest was an elderly woman who was vacuuming her carpet and saw large footprints in the carpet she had already vacuumed. She didn't hear anything but was terrified. Turns out her grandson had broken in and hid in the closet when she had her back turned, and the noise of the vacuum cleaner could cover it up. Strangest was a woman who called and reported that she had been robbed by a police officer and that she wanted to report him. She didn't have a name or description of the officer, but claimed it was one of you guys. She said the officer came to her house, took her money and left. She couldn't give us enough info and refused to give us an address, so she ended up hanging up. She called back a little later and had the same story, except it wasn't an officer, but someone with a logo shirt and hat approached her at her apartment, took her money and left. Again, refused to give us more info or her location, and hung up on us. This happened a few more times that night, with the story becoming a little clearer every time. By the time the morning came, we had deduced that she had simply ordered a pizza and paid for it. Not an operator myself, but used to know one. She always said the toughest calls were from parents that had accidentally hurt their kids. She once got one from a dad who had accidentally backed over his son playing in the driveway with his car. She didn't think that man would ever get right again. She wasn't sure she would. She also had more than one calls from parents that had brought their babies into bed with them, rolled onto them in the night and suffocated them. Those were the ones that haunted her. The ones where she knew she couldn't help. Not the injured, nor the ones that had caused the injury. I got a 911 call from a different country. Always double check your VoIP emergency settings. It's led to a few avoidable deaths. So I was working night shift when I get a call about a girl being followed. She kept on mentioning a nearby shop and Burger King as her location. The location sounded like it was a Spanish supermarket. Thinking it was nighttime, I instructed her to go to a well-lit, public place where it would be hard to be dragged away from, which was the Burger King. My Google Maps foo, which was usually on point, was failing me. I couldn't get the spelling of the name of the place and needed to clarify which part of the metro area she was in. So I asked her what city she was in. She replied by saying, "I'm in Florence." Florence, US state? Apostrophe. No. Florence, Italy. I ended the call by telling her to change the phone settings to local 911/get help from the Burger King. I don't know why she didn't realize that the 911 operator responded in perfect English with a southern accent wasn't Italian. She was on a study abroad and probably had her home police number set up in VoIP when she called 911. I spent the rest of the night confused, thinking I was hallucinating. I told my supervisor in the morning at shift change about it, and she confirmed it when I came back later for my next shift. Please subscribe and leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more of Reddit Universe.